Every adventurer in Tamriel carries a handful of small colored stones and never thinks twice about it. Soul gems. People mine them out of the ground like any other ore, sell them at any shop that deals in enchanting, and use them to charge a sword or a ring, the same way a person fills a lamp with oil. They're called morpholiths, and they work by trapping a soul at the moment of death and holding it there until a mage draws the power back out. That part is common knowledge. Almost nobody stops to ask where the things actually came from. They came from Molag Bal. He made them out of a portion of his own power, which means every enchanted blade in Tamriel runs, in some small way, on a piece of a Daedric prince. The black ones are worse. A black soul gem can hold the soul of a person instead of an animal, and those are made in the depths of Coldharbour, Bal's own realm, where he personally fine-tunes them to make them more efficient. Efficient is the actual word the old accounts use. Not powerful, not terrible. Efficient, the way a lord checks in on a foundry. Nobody selling soul gems out of a market stall thinks about any of that, and that's more or less the point of everything that follows. The clearest place to start is with a word that used to mean almost nothing. Corpus, in the old Khmeri tongue, just meant skin blight. That's the whole definition. Most people who came down with corpus in the early eras had a rash, nothing worse, caused by dirty living, bad food, or plain bad luck. A house healer during the interregnum wrote down the actual cure, and it reads like something a grandmother would say: bathe often, wear clean clothes, eat clean, pure food. In the Second Era, year 565, an entire outbreak on the western shore of Vardenfell, remembered afterward as the Flay Blight, turned out to be caused by nothing more sinister than a bad batch of face cream. Then the Third Era took that word, the one that used to mean a rash, and nailed it to something else completely. Dagoth-Ur made it. He had been Nerevar's closest friend and general once, before the Battle of Red Mountain, before the Tribunal, Almalexia, Sota Sil, and Vivek took the power of the heart of Lorkhan for themselves and became living gods, and had housed Dagoth, branded traitors, and scrubbed out of the record. Dagoth-Ur didn't die with the rest of his house. He and his kin slept beneath Red Mountain for close to 2,000 years, and came back in the Second Era, year 882, with a disease of his own design, spread through ash storms that blotted out the sky and killed plant, animal, and person alike. Corpus, the worst strain of that blight, spreads through contact with a corpus beast or through a specific curse, and once it takes hold, it destroys the victim's mind and grotesquely deforms the body. It's, by the plain admission of the people who study it, completely incurable. Here is the part nobody has ever managed to explain. The same infection produces two entirely different results. Devoted followers inside Dagoth-Ur's sixth house, the ones who accept the affliction willingly, ascend into distorted but lucid ash creatures who stay themselves in some real sense, reaching what the old texts call a higher spiritual state. Ordinary victims, the ones who catch it by accident, collapse into mindless husks, with no more mind left than the common undead a necromancer raises out of a grave. Nobody has worked out why one disease does both of those things to two different people. An Ashlander wise woman once described Dagoth-Ur as a man who heard laughter and love and answered it with monsters and ghouls, who wooed like a lover and delivered fear and plague instead. He didn't see it that way himself. He believed he was doing right by the Dunmer, and in his own accounting, the blight and the corpus it carried were gifts, not afflictions. The reasoning was specific. Generations earlier, after the Tribunal's betrayal at Red Mountain, Azura had cursed the Khmer, turning their skin ash gray and their eyes to fire, and that curse was what made the Dunmer the Dunmer. Dagoth-Ur looked at the deformities Corpus produced and called them the shedding of a cursed skin the Tribunal had forced on his people to begin with. He was offering his own curse as a cure for somebody else's. Divaith-Fir has a theory worth setting next to that one. He is a 4,000-year-old Dunmer sorcerer whose presence, according to the old accounts, could be sensed as far away as the Somerset Isles, and he doesn't think corpus is a disease at all in the ordinary sense. He calls it a divine blessing that most mortal bodies simply can't survive, and points to the fact that corpus victims stop aging entirely and become immune to every other illness theirs. Whether that makes it a blessing or a curse depends on which victim gets asked and how much of their mind is still there to answer. There were, for a while, ways to soften it. A blessing from Almalexia was said to protect a person infected with corpus from its worst effects, though the person could still spread the disease to others, which meant a blessed carrier could walk through a city passing on the curse and never show a symptom themselves. Offerings at the shrine of St. Mary's were said to grant resistance as well. And when the Nerevarine caught Corpus during the blight crisis of the Third Era, year 427, the cure Divite Fear provided didn't actually cure anything. It stripped away the crippling deformities and the insanity and left behind the immunity to disease, the added strength and endurance, and quite possibly the immortality. Fear's own patients, it turns out, were never really being treated for an illness. Some of them were being kept from a kind of recovery he didn't think they should have. The Tribunal Temple's actual policy for corpus victims is to ship them off to Tel Fear, where Divite Fear keeps a series of caverns beneath the tower called the Corpusarium. He collects the afflicted there and runs experiments looking for a cure that, by his own admission, doesn't exist yet. The outer chambers hold the more feral victims who attack on sight. Deeper in the section called the bowels, the ones housed there will not attack unless attacked first, as if whatever is left of a person gets a little more intact the further down the tunnels a visitor goes. The caverns are guarded by an Argonian named Vista Kai, one of Fear's own former slaves, who chose to stay on after Fear set him free. He taught himself to fight, became the warden of a cavern full of monsters, and eventually became trusted enough to help train Fear's own daughters in combat. The last known living Dwemer anywhere in the world, a man named Yagrum Bagarn, caught Corpus atop Red Mountain during his travels and ended up living out the rest of his existence in that same cavern. Offering theories nobody has ever been able to confirm about why his entire race disappeared thousands of years before. Vivek himself, writing about Dagoth Ur's return, described the darkness gathering beneath Red Mountain even as the rest of the world grew brighter. A darkness he called close kin to the very light Sota Sil had coaxed out of the heart of Lorkhan using Kagernak's own tools. Whatever that kinship actually means, it's the kind of line a god writes about an enemy he still, on some level, recognizes as family. Corpus happened to a body from outside, a disease that found people whether they wanted it or not. The next kind of horror in this world gets built into a person on purpose, sometimes by that person's own choice, and it starts with an actual physical heart. A Briarheart, sometimes written as Briarheart, is a reachfolk man or woman whose real heart has been cut out and replaced with a poisoned, engorged seed from a briar thicket. Hagraven magic makes the seed beat like a real heart again. The ritual needs Hircine's approval, since a Briarheart carries a piece of his hunting magic and he can refuse the transplant or later punish a Briarheart he judges unworthy with an eternity of being hunted inside his own realm. Briarhearts serve as living weapons, protectors of their clans, with enhanced hearing and strength that comes at the cost of constant pain. The chest cavity where a real heart should sit stays open, and warriors have to deal with the practical problem of insects and other small creatures taking shelter inside it. Different clans do the rite differently. The Cinderheart clan, who worship Molag Bal, pack the open chest with hot coals instead of a plain seed. Thornroot clan shamans use blessed tools so the ritual doesn't anger the spirits involved. Winterborn Hagravens can sense objects their revived Briarhearts touch from a distance, and some Winterborn Briarhearts go through a second transformation into something called a Briarheart Tree Lurcher. Being made into one against a person's will, rather than choosing it, is considered a genuine sacrilege among the clans, and using the rite as punishment is frowned upon just as strongly, even though both still happen. A Briarheart's rest, once they finally die for good, depends on their original discarded heart being treated with some respect, purified at a shrine of Mara and properly buried, or their spirit can't fully settle even after the body is gone. The ritual's origin isn't a horror story though. It's a love story, and the man at the center of it's King Faulan of the Reach, better known as Red Eagle. Around the First Era, year 1028, augurs had foreseen that Faulan would unite the 10 warring kingdoms of the Reach under his name, and for a while it looked like it might happen. Then Empress Hestra's armies arrived. One by one the kings of the Reach swore loyalty to her or died fighting her. Faulan refused to yield. Every ally he had either surrendered, defected, or was killed, until nobody was left standing beside him, and it was at that point, with the war already lost, that his own people's elders, frightened of what continuing to resist would cost them, exiled him. He met the Hagraven during that exile. She offered him the power to free his people in exchange for his heart. Before he could accept, he had to clear his mind completely and fill it, deliberately, with the thing he loved most, which was his people. He did, and she took the old heart and gave him the new one, and he became the first Briarheart. It cost him. His eyes turned permanently black, and something in him that had been human before was gone, replaced by a spirit of vengeance with no room left for remorse. He fought for 2 years, wielding a flaming sword called Red Eagle's Fury, described in old Vateshran tales as a blade no ring and no steel could turn aside, gathering reachmen who still wanted the old ways, and in that time he drove the occupying Imperials almost entirely out of the Reach. 2 different accounts describe his last stand differently, and both are worth keeping rather than picking one. One says Hestra's generals returned with a bigger force and laid siege to his stronghold until he came out alone and naked to meet them, killing 1,000 soldiers before they finally brought him down. The other says it took more than 100 arrows to put him down. Whichever is closer to the truth, his own warriors said that in his final moments, his black eyes turned clear again. The Hagraven who made him came back for her property. During his own funeral, while his people were still preparing his body for burial, she tore the darkened Briarheart out of his chest, brushing off 100 armed reachmen who tried to stop her, telling them she was something beyond the spear, the sword, and the bow. Before he died, he made his people swear an oath. Keep fighting, and when the Reach was finally free, bring his sword back to him, and he would rise again to lead them. They carried him deep into a cave prepared as a tomb, and sealed it with wax and shattered flints, his sword set on a pedestal near his body, and they laid traps to keep out grave robbers. The tomb looked plain near the entrance, but deeper in, the rough rock gave way to hewn stone covered in murals of his last battle, and even so, the sarcophagus at the center of it all was left simple, no different from any other stone box. The oath turned out to be literally true. Before the Second Era, year 582, a Breton scholar researching Red Eagle entered the tomb, felt something pulling him toward the burial chamber, and picked up the sword. He heard Faulan's own voice in his head. Convinced by visions and promises of power, he laid the blade back in the sarcophagus next to the body, and the Reachfolk king woke from his slumber in a skeletal form. The terrified scholar stole the sword back and fled, losing it somewhere along the way and accidentally sealing the tomb behind him. Faulan sat in there, undead, half-remembered and half-worshipped by the Forsworn, who would later claim him as an ancestor, for roughly 1100 years, until the last Dragonborn broke into the tomb in the Fourth Era, year 201, killed what he had become, and took the sword for good. His legend didn't stay confined to his own tomb either. Generations later, a Yokudan sword saint named Rada al-Saran, who had lost the ability to summon his own spirit blade, traveled all the way to the Reach purely on the strength of stories about a warrior who carried a living flame for a sword. Faulan taught him the same trick that had once made him a Briarheart, clearing the mind and filling it with whatever mattered most, and Rada reforged his own blade in what the old accounts call bitter blood, turning it permanently red in the process. Centuries after that, a descendant of Faulan's bloodline, a Reach infant named Biora, was raised in total ignorance of who she came from, taken in a raid and brought up as a Nord, until a coven convinced itself she was prophesied to rule them and showed her a vision of a crowned red eagle standing next to a fanged stranger she would not understand for years. The line he started didn't stay buried with him any more than he did. Red Eagle's power came from a Hagraven, and Hagravens are their own kind of horror, because becoming one is also a choice. Hagravens are a cross between an old woman and a bird, and they were witches once. Ordinary women who went through a ritual that traded their humanity for magic, a transformation that works its way into every part of their new being. They eat people alive, and they especially like fresh eyeballs. They stink, described in the old accounts as known for their foul stench. They can turn into a murder of crows and attack from 100 directions at once, and Reach Folk's survival advice says flatly that a Hagraven who has truly decided somebody should die is nearly impossible to escape, though she isn't especially fast on her own 2 feet, so running is sometimes an option before she makes up her mind. Some Reach clans revere Hagravens as matriarchs and leaders, other clans revile and fear them. Both attitudes exist in the Reach at the same time, sometimes in neighboring valleys. The Daedric Prince Nocturnal is considered kin to hags and Hagravens generally, and one particular Hagraven Daedra Lord, called the Crow Mother, claims to be her nether niece and has spawned a whole line of Crow Daedra known as the Blackfeather Court. In Glenumbra, a Hagraven called Mother Murk allied herself with a group called the Bloodthorn Cult and increased the number of women being abducted and converted into hags and thralls until she was killed and the region restored to a coven called the Beldama. The transformation can be undone, and the record says plainly that nobody knows whether it can be undone without a god's help. There's exactly one known case of it happening. A Hagraven called Keeper Ormi had turned, at some point the record doesn't specify, and believed her son Sahun was dead. He wasn't. He revealed himself to still be alive, prayed for her, and Kain, hearing that prayer, cleansed her and forgave her. That's the whole surviving account. No description of what Ormi did as a Hagraven, no explanation of how the prayer worked, no word on what happened to her afterward. One sentence and then silence. Hagraven body parts get used for practical things once the creature is dead. Their claws go into alchemy, and drinking vessels carved from a hollowed Hagraven claw were believed to make alcohol stronger. Their feathers make quills, long and sharp, sometimes fitted with silver, and one, called the Black Quill, was commissioned by an orc lorekeeper named Razotha Taleteller and said to be enchanted so that any story written with it would never be forgotten. Some Reach folk chandeliers use Hagraven materials too. A stone carving from the Second Era, year 582, shows a Hagraven with a swollen, distended belly, and nobody has ever settled whether it's meant as a fertility symbol or a picture of a Hagraven eating children. Some of them turn up far from the Reach entirely. An event called the Wild Hunt, staged by the Bosmer generations earlier to bring down a high king named Borgas, spawned a whole crop of monstrosities alongside its intended target, and Reachfolk hunters who went looking through the wreckage came home with one of the Hagravens it had produced, proof that becoming one of these creatures isn't something the Reach holds any kind of monopoly on. Hagravens and Briarhearts are the Reach's own horrors, sanctioned quietly by Hircine on the side. There's a Daedric prince whose entire portfolio is disease, and unlike Dagoth Ur, he doesn't think he is doing anyone a favor by accident. He thinks he is doing them a favor on purpose, and says so. Pariate is the Daedric prince of pestilence, and his sphere covers tasks, contamination, and natural order, described in the old texts as ordering the lowest orders of oblivion. His full title list reads like an insult and a compliment stacked on top of each other: the Taskmaster, the Blighted Lord, the Lord of Infection and Pestilence. And, without any apparent irony, the Lord of Abundant Pus and Bountiful Vomit. He blesses his worshippers with disease, and he means it sincerely, as a gift. A cult called the Diseased, along with a related order of the Sacred Skeever, describe themselves as social outcasts who would be glad to catch a disease and die in their own filth, exactly as Pariate intended. And they list off the specific afflictions they hope for like a shopping list: fungal infections, scabies, rashes, mucus-filled lungs, tooth decay. A group in Skyrim's Reach called the Afflicted were given a plague along with some resistance to its worst effects, which turned their skin bright red and let them spit poisonous vomit at enemies, and they drank their own brute poisons as medicine while they waited for Periate's command to spread his blessing to the rest of the world. Not every one of his priests stays loyal. One named Orshendor, who had led the afflicted to their shelter at an old Dwemer ruin called Batardums, eventually lost faith and abandoned Periate's worship outright. Periate had him hunted down and killed for it, and sent his soul specifically to the pits to be punished there, while the afflicted he had once led were simply left scattered, still waiting on a command that never came. One story shows what dealing with him actually costs a person who asks for help. In the Second Era, year 573, the city of Tyr was hit with chill nights out of season, then a flood, then a miasma that brought a whole list of named plagues down on the population, and neighboring towns refused to send aid for fear of catching it themselves. A healer named Rindril Thirano summoned Periate, who appeared as a ghostly skeever, and threatened to spread disease, curing knowledge everywhere, to shrink Periate's own influence unless the plague was lifted. Periate agreed, and kept his word. Tyr went free of illness for a year and a day. Rindril paid for it personally. His limbs weakened, his skin turned scaly and lizard-like on one arm, while boils grew on the other. Food lost all taste, and near the end he wrote that he could feel something moving inside his own chest. He was found dead in his office and burned to stop whatever had gotten into him from spreading, and some witnesses swore the body was still moving as it went onto the fire. Outside, the people of Tyr were celebrating their good health, while he died alone. There's an old story about a kind of giant frog that envied dragons enough to strike a bargain with him for wings. Periate gave them the wings. Their bodies shrank down to almost nothing in exchange, which is about as concise a summary of bargaining with him as exists anywhere. A dragon priest named Zan turned to his worship after her own dragon lord abandoned her, and he rewarded her loyalty with the artifact called Spellbreaker. Her cult experimented on a mountain full of ogres, giants, and other creatures with a disease meant to weaken and kill. It did the opposite. The disease made every creature it touched stronger and more aggressive instead of sicker, which is either a design flaw or, depending on how a person reads Periate's own sense of humor, exactly the kind of joke he would consider worth telling. Worshippers who want his direct attention summon him on a specific day, the 9th of Rain's Hand, using an offering of vampire dust, a silver ingot, a deathbell flower, and a flawless ruby, and a whole society of wealthy nobles across Tamriel, calling themselves the Natural Order, keeps up his worship in secret behind otherwise respectable lives. At a place called Bal Sunar, an entire community built him a temple because their own leader believed he offered better protection from a regional plague than any other god available, and the sacrifices made there are said to have produced small, unrecognizable creatures, nicknamed Periate's Glory, blobs capable of draining the strength out of anyone who touches them. Cut dialogue from an old text once called him the most affable of the Daedra princes, with the worst reputation, polite even when a request is refused, never given to rage. His own realm, called the Pits, is only partly mapped even by the people whose job is mapping realms of oblivion. Part of it's a rocky cave system lit by floating green embers and choked with poisonous fog, and part of it looks like the Deadlands, lava seas, and ruined structures. And the scholars who study these things are not sure how anyone actually gets in or out. He has not always stood alone either. When Hermaius Mora once moved to erase a rival prince from existence and from memory entirely, Vermina and Periate both refused to help him do it, arguing that a Daedric prince's own sphere should be untouchable even from another prince's judgment. Mora went ahead without them, and the two princes retaliated by unleashing an arcane plague, built from Periate's disease mixed with Vermina's own stolen dream essence, that tore into Mora's realm, blinded and maddened his servants, and very nearly severed his own link to the knowledge he guards. It was, by any measure, a fight between gods that started because one of them refused to let the others keep their own rules. The plague itself traveled inside sealed censers, planted by a cult calling itself the Hidden Kindred and led by a high priest named Blightcrown. And one shipment was smuggled specifically into a city of the dead called Necrom, hidden among the keepers who tend it, purely to force a rival cult into surrendering an artifact they were guarding. It took mortal intervention in the end to settle a quarrel between gods, which says something about how far even a Daedric prince will go to win an argument with his own kind. He is depicted often as a green four-legged dragon, and his resemblance to Akatosh, the god of time, is described in the old texts as some primordial and curious jest. Nobody explains the joke. He is also, officially, considered one of the weaker Daedric princes, which sits strangely next to the fact that his plagues have been judged capable of wiping out all of Tamriel on their own, and have even infected other Daedric princes and their own realms. Corprus, Briarheart's, Hagraven's, and Periate's plagues all happen to individuals, one body or one soul at a time. What comes next happened to entire peoples, and two of those peoples are not here anymore to argue about how it's told. The Thracian plague is remembered as the day half of everyone alive simply died, and even the date it happened isn't settled. Most accounts put it in the First Era, year 2200. Some put it as late as year 2260. One single source on the Sload themselves manages to give both dates in two different paragraphs, which is either carelessness or proof that nobody was keeping careful records while half a continent was dying. The Sload built it. They're a race of slug-like, sometimes described as toad-like, beastfolk who live in isolated coral kingdoms called Thras, west of Tamriel, and one scholar who studied them later theorized that the infected sea creatures the Sload unleashed were mutated versions of the Sload's own young. They spread the plague by driving infected sea beasts onto the coastlines, an exact chain of landfalls recorded in order: the Abetian, Hughes Bane, South Point, Malabal Tor, Daggerfall, Cape Shira, the Gold Coast, then inland as far as elsewhere. Roughly half the population of the Iliac Bay died, and some accounts extend that estimate to all of Tamriel, though nobody ever produced a hard number, only hundreds of thousands of misshapen corpses left behind. The symptoms were boils, brittle bones, mucus seeping from the eyes and ears, and a thirst so unbearable it drove people mad. It spread at what the old accounts call a supernatural speed, and resisted every attempt at a cure. A number of healers died trying to find one, and all they proved was that the disease wasn't natural to begin with. Divide Fear, the same sorcerer who keeps the Corpusarium running centuries later, put forward his own theory about where the plague came from in the first place. He believed the infected sea creatures the Sload unleashed were mutated versions of the Sload's own young, which would mean the weapon that killed half a continent was built out of the Sload's own children. An archmage named Sirabane is said to have used a powerful ring of his own to save a considerable number of people from the disease during the worst of it, and some accounts credit him with finding an actual cure, though nobody has ever confirmed what became of that cure afterward. A kinlord named Nempharion, who lived through it in Somerset, left behind an account still quoted today. It was ever present, ever penetrating, he wrote, seeping into every person, every creature, every drop of water, seeking to be quenched. And the afflicted drank themselves to corpulence with each passing day, until their bones cracked under their bulging flesh. Nempharion ruled the city of Korgrad. When the plague reached his walls, he flooded his own city, trying to stop it from spreading further, and drowned most of his own people in the attempt. The Korgrad wastes carried a reputation for corruption for centuries afterward, and as late as the Second Era, year 582, plague-bearers were reportedly still alive out there, using blood sorcery to hold their own symptoms at bay more than 1,000 years after the outbreak that infected them. Here is the turn, the part that makes this a horror story rather than only a tragedy. While the plague was still killing people by the thousands, the Sload used the chaos as cover to sail in, sack several cities along the coast, and enslave whoever was left standing. It wasn't an accident of timing, it was the plan. Bendu Olo, the Baron Admiral who would later lead the counterattack, described the Sload as a people who barely experience emotion the way other races do, who are skilled at faking it when useful, and who honor laws, loyalties, and friendships only for as long as it serves their own interests. Their own language, by his account, has no word for adventure. The closest equivalent translates to tragic disaster. Retaliation came. The All Flags Navy assembled ships from nearly every nation in western Tamriel, ancient enemies setting aside their differences to sail against a common target, and on the way they fought a sea beast called the Molmor, described as a cross between a massive whale and an octopus, bristling with spines each longer than a knight's lance. A young druid tricked it into swallowing an enchanted clod of earth that turned it to stone where it sat, and the stone remains today as an island called Molmor Islet. The fleet reached Thras, destroyed the coral tower on its largest island, and the resulting whirlpool swallowed the entire archipelago along with part of the fleet that had come to sink it. The aftermath reshaped the map. Political power in the Iliac Bay shifted west, away from the Old Order, and helped set off a war that ended 1,000 years of Alessian rule. In Elsewhere, 16 peaceful, coexisting Khajiit kingdoms that had resisted every foreign invasion before this one collapsed into two politically divided, culturally opposed states, called Palatine and Anakina, and they have never fully reunited since. Bendu Olo himself carried a new name back from that campaign, remembered afterward as the dealer of swift justice to the foul spot of Thras. A Dunmer fleet captain who sailed with him described sea beasts that looked like blighted whales rising out of the water and spraying clouds of acidic fluid that dissolved anything they touched, stopped only by fire, while riders on their backs cast pain spells on any elf who got close enough to fight them by hand. Whatever the Sloat actually were before this war, the fleet that finally reached their coral kingdoms wasn't fighting an ordinary enemy, and didn't treat it like one. The Thracian Plague was a weapon aimed broadly at everyone it could reach. Centuries later, in the Second Era, a different disease showed up that seemed to know the difference between one person and another, and the fact that it could tell is the whole horror of this next one. The Knahaten flu lasted 43 years, from the Second Era, year 560, to year 603, and it began in a place called Stormhold before spreading through every corner of Black Marsh and beyond. It killed nearly everyone who caught it, except Argonians. Argonians could catch it too, but for them it stayed mild, almost nothing. While it killed nearly every non-Argonian who came into contact with it, nobody has ever agreed on why the disease behaved that way. There are 3 separate explanations on record, and none of them line up. One account blames an Argonian shaman who, in retaliation for how badly his people had been treated by everyone else, engineered the disease through what the old texts call a manipulation of the Hist, the sentient trees Argonians consider sacred. Because Argonians turned out to be immune, this was the version most people believed at the time. A second account calls it natural, nothing more, and gives no further detail at all. A third, stranger account comes from an Aelid spirit, who implies the flu was originally an Aelid weapon built specifically to wipe out a people called the Kothringi, and who seems almost embarrassed that the weapon left any Kothringi survivors behind. The record itself refuses to pick a winner among the 3. Regardless of the flu's actual source, it says, the situation in Black Marsh grew steadily more favorable to the Argonians the longer the disease burned through everyone else, which is the kind of sentence that only makes sense if nobody was ever going to settle the question. Argonians, for their part, pointed out that they considered the hardest hit Khajiit their friends, and noted that Argonians could catch the flu too, just mildly. As if to say, a weapon built by them would not have spared their allies quite this thoroughly. The symptoms moved fast and ugly. General weakness first, then a racking cough, high fever, blood running from the nose, the eyes, and eventually the mouth, and a red, granular rash that spread across the whole body without ever itching. Death usually came within 3 days, though some victims lingered for a week. Sorghum tea and chicken broth eased the worst of it. A Redguard healer named Perizada reportedly saved an entire village with a potion boiled from Clanfear claws in salt water, then died of the flu herself not long after. At its worst, the flu reached across most of Tamriel, from Black Marsh south into Morrowind, across the Topol Bay into Elsewhere, then onto Valenwood and even High Rock. It wiped out the entire royal family of Wayrest, ending a dynasty outright. It killed the celebrated Bosmer hero Orain Bearclaw. It nearly wiped out an entire religion in Valenwood, worshippers of a god named Zen, who abandoned him soon after, simply because there were too few of them left to keep up the faith. In the Khajiit city of Senchal, an entire strain crossed the water in year 560 and burned through the population so badly that whole neighborhoods were deliberately burned to the ground to slow it. And 300 years later, visitors could still see the blackened skylines where those neighborhoods used to be. Altmer Aid saved a great many Khajiit lives during the crisis, a debt of gratitude that Khajiit leaders would later cite as one reason they joined the Aldmeri Dominion. Survivors were not always welcomed back. Khajiit who recovered from the flu, no longer contagious, were still cast out of their own society by neighbors too frightened to take the risk. A group of these survivors gathered at a place called Esrendar's Cradle looking for healing, were turned away out of fear they would spread the disease further, and lived in exile in a nearby canyon for over 18 years, becoming known simply as the Stricken. In Sentinel, King Ramzi the Distrit decided the plague was divine punishment aimed specifically at his own personal failings, and sealed himself alone inside his palace rather than risk catching it, then slowly starved to death in there anyway, too afraid of the disease to come out even for food, leaving his own kingdom in chaos while he did it. The flu tried to come back once, generations later, when a sorceress named Gedna Relvel, sealed away for practicing forbidden magic, had her tomb unsealed in the Third Era, year 427, and attempted to spread a version of the same plague through infected rats before the Nerevarine cut it off, having barely reached more than a handful of people. Elsewhere, during the original outbreak, a duke on the Sistras archipelago sealed the islands off entirely once the flu reached them, in year 563, stopping trade debt in its tracks and losing considerable standing with his own royal court over the decision, even though it may well have saved lives. Nobody was even sure how the disease actually spread. One account insisted it traveled on the air itself, another blamed direct contact with the telltale rash, and the fact that people who covered their rashes with cloth and bandages caught it less often than those who didn't seems to support the second theory, though neither was ever proven outright. The flu quietly rearranged the whole political map of the era. It helped end the Second Empire's grip on Black Marsh. It wiped out Wayrest's royal line and helped bring on the war that followed. It gave Argonians enough standing to join the Ebonheart Pact eventually as equals rather than as slaves. Even Tiber Septim, centuries later, is said to have thought twice before invading Black Marsh, a province that had already proven it could survive something that killed almost everyone else who touched it. The Nahatan flu reshaped a map. For one people living inside that map, it didn't reshape anything, it erased them. The Kothringi, also called the lustrous folk for their silver skin, were native to Black Marsh and believed to be descended from the Nedes. For a long time, they were considered the only humans native to Tamriel at all, a belief later scholarship corrected once other tribal groups turned up in the record. They were avid sailors with an unusual, idiosyncratic style of shipbuilding that let their vessels handle both open coastal water and shallow swamp, and it's thought, though never proven outright, that Kothringi ships may have carried the Knahatan flu to Valenwood and beyond themselves, spreading the very disease that would go on to finish them. Two of their settlements, called Stillrise Village and Zook, were already empty of life within a single year of the outbreak starting. By the Second Era, year 864, imperial scholars considered the entire Kothringi people extinct. Not everyone went quietly. A group of infected Kothringi fled on a vessel remembered as the Crimson Ship, launched on the 9th day of First Seed in the Second Era, year 563. Every port turned them away. After a full year adrift, they finally reached Hammerfell, found no one willing to shelter them there either, and sailed on west into the Abetian Sea. What happened after that's where the record simply runs out. One account, likely fictional by its own admission, has pirates finding the ship years later with its entire crew dead. Another, from a Khajiit beggar who claimed to have encountered it decades on, is flagged even by the people who recorded it as unreliable. Neither one is treated as confirmed. To this day, Hammerfell marks the 20th of Rain's Hand as the Day of Shame, and nobody in the province leaves their house on that day, because the story people still tell is that the Crimson Ship might come back. A handful of Kothringi cheated the extinction in stranger ways. The chief of Stilrise village struck a desperate pact with the Daedric prince Clavicus Vile to save his people, and Vile kept his end of the bargain, though he turned the entire village into immortal, undead skeletons to do it, maintained afterward by illusion magic so they could pass for living. In Zook, a lone man named Drilk survived by absorbing the power of an object called a keystone, becoming, generations later, a person of interest to two rival factions who both wanted that same power for themselves, though taking it, he warned them, would kill him outright. What is left of the Kothringi, otherwise, is almost nothing. They preferred to go without clothes, worship the god of toil named Zen, alongside Dibella, Mara, and Kinnereth, and built a music-centered culture around hollow log drums, bow harps strung with sinew, and chimes, which by every account were their favorite instrument of all. One craftsman among them said to have hung hundreds of tin and copper chimes from the branches around his own home. They invited Argonians to their feasts, specifically to hear them play, a small, ordinary kindness sitting oddly next to older wars the two peoples had once fought against each other. They buried their dead in cairns decorated with glass beads, and some people in the ruined city of Gideon still claim to feel Kothringi spirits lingering there. One Kothringi knight, remembered only as Zook, conspired with an empress named Tavia to assassinate her own husband, the last ruler of an entire dynasty, and later founded the town that still carries his name in Shadowfen today. Some scholars think the Kothringi were related to an older tribe called the Kothri, Nedic people the Aelids are said to have kept as slaves back in the early First Era, which would mean the very ancestors of the people the Aelids may have later targeted with a flu built specifically to wipe them out had already spent generations under Aelid rule once before. A whole people who were, for a long stretch of history, considered the only humans this continent ever produced on its own. And what is left to show for it fits in a handful of ruins nobody has fully searched. The Kothringi tried to run, and mostly didn't make it. Another people in the same province tried something different when the killing started, generations earlier, and it didn't save them either, not in the end. The Lilmothiet, also called the Fox Folk, were a Vulpine people who once lived in Black Marsh, possibly related, some scholars think, to the Khajiit of elsewhere, though nothing in the record actually backs that up beyond speculation. They were nomadic, and they left behind almost nothing. That isn't an exaggeration for effect. It's the entire shape of their history, as anyone has managed to record it. When elven invaders came for the region, an allied tribe, called the Fauns, chose to fight. The Lilmothiet chose to hide instead, taking their kits with them into hiding rather than risking them in a war. They survived that particular threat. It didn't matter in the long run. For generations afterward, they simply declined, withdrawing further and further inland toward a settlement called Blackrose, until by the Second Era they were scarcely seen at all. Scholars from High Rock came to believe, though nobody stated it as settled fact, that the Knahaten flu was what finally finished off the ones who had stayed behind in the city of Lilmoth. Even what they built got repurposed without much ceremony. Some of the old Lilmothiet ruins at Blackrose were turned into a prison in a single day, using an army of summoned stone Atronachs on the order of a Second Era potentate who needed a prison and didn't need a ruin. By the Second Era, year 582, the only lasting trace of the Lilmothit left in ordinary life was a child's toy, a bright orange paper kite shaped like a fox with a real fox's tail attached, sold under the name Lilmothiet Fox Kite, because somewhere along the way, that's what an entire people's memory had been reduced to. Those 4 peoples and their plagues are gone, or nearly gone, but at least they're at rest. What comes next is about the ones who are not. Next to a Briarheart ritual or a Hagravant's Price, the soul gems mentioned earlier are the most ordinary horror of all, precisely because using one requires no cult, no altar, no bargain. A mage just needs one. They come in 6 ordinary grades, from smallest to largest: minor, petty, lesser, common, greater, grand. Above even a grand gem sit 2 named artifacts, the Amulet of Kings and Azura's Star, both said to be able to hold something the ordinary grades can't, a divine soul. Below all of that, sits a much stranger division that has nothing to do with size. Souls captured for these gems get sorted into black and white. Black meaning the soul of anyone from a sapient race, white meaning anything lesser, an animal, a beast, and the record admits flatly that the line itself is arbitrary. It was drawn on purpose, generations ago, by a mage named Vanus Galerion, specifically to limit how much soul trapping people were doing, and by the Third Era, the taboo against trapping a black soul had outlived the very institution that invented it. Mages kept avoiding it long after the guild that first told them to was already gone. This wasn't always how it worked. Soul trapping goes back at least to the First Era, when a technique in Black Marsh bound a soul into an unhatched egg, and it was banned there, but not for the reason anyone would guess. It was banned because the technique kept going wrong, not because anyone thought it was monstrous. That ban held until the Mages Guild was founded, in the Second Era, year 230, after which soul trapping was reinstated and, over the following decades, standardized into the spell and gem system used across Tamriel today. Some of the largest deposits sit under Skyrim, in an immense cavern the Dwemer called Faljardum Din, translated as the Blackest Kingdom reaches, and known today simply as Blackreach. It's lit only by glowing mushrooms, threaded with rare geode veins, and was once a highway connecting several Dwemer cities before it became a haven for vampire clans, Animunculi, and the blind, corrupted Falmer. During one war, a Dominion scout named Vol fell through a shaft into the cavern, ate a chorus to survive, and unknowingly swallowed a soul gem hidden inside it, along with the meal, which left him with a sudden, inexplicable talent for fixing machinery, enough to repair an ancient lift and climb his way back out. The same cavern grows a rare variety of nirnroot found nowhere else on Tamriel, tinted crimson and thriving in symbiosis with the glowing mushrooms around it, prized enough by alchemists that people have gone looking for it in a realm otherwise known mainly for vampires, blind elves, and the machines that used to run the place before any of them arrived. Sotasil, one of the living gods of Morrowind, thought the standard soul gem was beneath him as a power source for his mechanical constructs, and built something he called an animo core instead, a brass vessel packed with ground geodistillate. He went further than that in private, working out how to reverse the process entirely and turn ordinary soul gems into black ones, testing the technique on 3 elderly temple saints named Felms, Olms, and Lothis, placing their souls into mechanical bodies. All 3 went insane, the same as everyone else who had gone through that kind of transfer before them, and his own people banned the study of black soul gems the moment they learned what he had done. Nobody outside the Clockwork City ever knew he had gotten there first. A handful of named soul gems turn up across the historical record and give some sense of how far the practice spread. A gem called Ator's Soul Gem, cut like a red diamond and set with a dragon, once held the soul of a crown prince before it was moved into a sword forged especially to carry him. A gem belonging to a woman named Quintilla was cut and shaped into an ordinary-looking gemstone, and remains the only known soul gem on record that has been enchanted and then re-enchanted a second time. Hermaeus Mora himself is said to keep a black soul gem large enough to hold several souls at once, rather than the usual one. And somewhere in the world sits a colossal black soul gem holding nothing less than the soul of a former archmage of the Mages Guild, proof that rank inside the very institution that regulates this practice offers no protection from ending up inside one of these things. In at least a few recorded cases, a trapped soul manages to hold on to its own awareness the entire time it sits inside the gem, which is a strange kind of consolation prize next to what supposedly happens to a soul once it moves on to the soul cairn instead, where memory fades rather than survives. A few stranger substitutes exist for anyone without an actual gem on hand. Some enchantments can be recharged with blood instead. In a realm called the Shivering Isles, something called a soul tomato can apparently serve the exact same function as a soul gem, which raises more questions than it answers about what a soul tomato actually is, and none of the old texts bother answering them. Soul gems are mined, sold, and used every day without ceremony. What happens after one gets used, once the enchantment is finished and the power is spent, is a separate question, and a vampire named Valerica is the one who worked out an answer nobody has ever fully confirmed. Valerica, a vampire lord tied to Castle Volkihar, theorized that when a soul trapped in a black soul gem gets spent powering an enchantment, the remnant of that soul doesn't simply vanish. It gets transported instead to a realm called the Soul Cairn, to roam there for what she believed would be eternity. The word she used was theorized, not confirmed, and a second, separate source hedges the same claim with the word supposedly, which means two different accounts of the same mechanism, both stop short of calling it settled fact. Nobody has explained how she reached the theory in the first place, or why only black soul gems would produce this effect rather than any other kind. What is better documented is what happens to a soul once it actually gets there. Mortal souls sent to the Soul Cairn eventually lose all memory of who they used to be. Only the newest arrivals still carry any wisps of their old identity, and those wisps fade the longer a soul stays. Anyone who wanders through the realm reports hearing blessings, curses, and ghostly warnings from the souls scattered across it, voices with less and less of a person left behind them the longer they have been there. Somewhere in that realm, right now, there's presumably a soul that still half remembers being a person, actively forgetting as the moment passes. Valerica built her own way in and out of the realm, a silver-lined portal requiring exactly 4 ingredients: finely ground bone meal, purified void salts, soul gem shards, and blood, either her own or a close relative's. The portal has one rule built into it that never bends: it rejects the fully living outright. Only the undead, vampires included, and the partially soul-trapped living can pass through it at all, which sorts every visitor into exactly 3 categories before they ever set foot inside: fully alive and turned away, partly claimed and admitted, or already dead and welcome. The cairn isn't only a place where souls end up, it also makes the very kind of gem that feeds it. Lightning strikes the ground there constantly, and certain devices can harness those strikes to produce fresh black soul gems on the spot, which means the realm isn't simply a dumping ground for spent souls. It can manufacture the exact instrument that sends more souls its way, a closed loop feeding on itself, with no outside hand required to keep it running. Valerica's portal wasn't even the first way in or out of the place. An older link once ran through a doorway at a citadel called Battlespire, before that citadel was partially destroyed and the connection severed, which means at least 2 separate doorways into this realm have existed across recorded history, and there's no particular reason to assume either of them is the last. Valerica's theory explains what happens to a soul after it's spent. It doesn't explain who is actually running the place those souls end up in, and the answer turns out to be stranger than a Daedric prince. The ideal masters are not Daedric princes at all. They started out as an early order of mortal sorcerers, practicing necromancy and trafficking in souls, who grew powerful enough over time that their own physical bodies started to feel like a limitation, so they discarded them. They transcended into pure soul energy, entered oblivion as immortals, and carved out a realm of their own from a patch of chaotic creatia, calling it the Soul Cairn, and calling themselves the makers of the Soul Cairn. They think of what they do as a kindness. Their own account describes freeing mortals from life and dooming them to undeath as a way of saving those mortals from meaningless hardship, granting them peaceful eternal life. The souls actually living that peaceful eternal life describe it, instead, as a curse, and the record doesn't pretend those 2 views can be reconciled. It simply states both and leaves them sitting there, unresolved, next to each other. Individual masters have names. Nobody speaks them. They're described as so exalted that they can't be spoken aloud, which means even scholars who have studied the cairn for years can't tell a listener which master they're quoting. They rarely bother to take a physical shape at all, preferring something closer to omnipresence, but when they do, it takes one of 2 forms: a small red crystal resting quietly in a coffin used only for speaking, or a much larger pink crystal, usually found hovering above some ruined structure as though guarding treasure, through which a master can drain the life out of anyone who gets close enough, an effect that can only be blocked by eating a plant native to the realm called a soul husk. One account, offered as one source's claim rather than settled fact, describes the masters instead as disembodied entities living in a distant Platonic ideal, with their only connection to the cairn running through small magical gems that let them sense and communicate with whatever is happening there. Whether that's really what they're, or whether they're simply revenant spirits who prefer to seem more abstract than they actually are, nobody outside the cairn is in a position to say. Their business model runs on transactions. Necromancers strike bargains with them for armies of undead in exchange for a supply of souls, and more than once, the necromancers supplying those souls ended up trapped alongside them, betrayed by the very masters they thought they were dealing with. A dragon named Durnevier made a deal with them once and was left eternally trapped inside the cairn as payment for his own trust. Survivors of a plague among the Kothringi once aligned themselves with the Masters rather than face annihilation outright, and during an ancient Daedric invasion, Mehrunes Dagon's forces stormed the realm, looking to use it as a way station, killed the Master's servants, plundered their treasures, and accidentally freed several mortal souls Dagon himself had once betrayed, before a lone apprentice, helped by exactly one sympathetic master out of all of them, found a way to force the invaders back out. A cult devoted to Mehrunes Dagon was once caught quietly collecting souls in black soul gems specifically as payment for the masters, and nobody has ever explained what that cult actually got in return for the favor. Even the developers who built the game where all this first appeared referred to the ideal masters in their own private notes by an unofficial nickname, Gem Vampires, which isn't a bad description of an order of the dead that lives on other people's souls. The masters keep their own retainers as well, old servants of what the record calls an ancient alliance between Daedra and mortal men who achieved something like the master's own immortality through a separate ritual, deliberately splitting their spirits from their bodies until the two halves settled into a kind of eternal consciousness on their own. Together with the masters themselves, this whole staff of the dead gets referred to simply as the Soul Guard, or, less formally, the Blessed, an odd word to use for a workforce made entirely of people who no longer have bodies to go with their souls. Valerica herself was kept prisoner there for several eras after fleeing into the realm with an object called an Elder Scroll, until she was finally rescued in the 4th era, year 201. Whatever peace the Masters believe they're offering, the one named individual in this whole story who actually got out of the Soul Cairn did so by being rescued, not by being convinced. The ideal Masters run their realm as a business, and business is exactly the right word for what happens next, because the entire modern discipline of necromancy traces back to a single theft carried out by one woman for reasons that were mostly personal. Manimarco is remembered today as the King of Worms, the founder and object of worship of a cult called the Order of the Black Worm, but he started out as an Altmer mage studying under the Sigic Order on the Isle of Artaeum, the same place at the same time, as a fellow student named Vanus Galerion, the man who would later draw the arbitrary line between black souls and white souls mentioned earlier. Manimarco's early necromancy experiments started on animals and escalated quickly to using his own classmates as test subjects, and when the Sigic Order finally expelled him for it, sometime around the 2nd era, year 230, Galerion split off in disgust and founded the Mages Guild instead, the same guild that would go on to standardize soul trapping and eventually lift the old Black Marsh ban. The expulsion itself wasn't quiet. By one account, the ancient tower where the Psijics confronted him seemed to lurch bodily around them as the confrontation happened, and once his sentence was passed, he was stripped of his robes while shouting curses in old, half-forgotten tongues, and finally vanished in a flash of purple light while Venus himself shouted after him, demanding to know whether the order really meant to unleash a broken man like him on the rest of Tamriel. Later records remember Manimarco as the first of what people call the Undying Liches, and possibly, though nobody is fully certain, the very first necromancer this world ever produced. Manimarco went the other way entirely. He wrote a book called A World of Corpses, defending necromancy outright, treated killing anyone who questioned his methods as doing Tamriel a service by winnowing out weaker mages, and gathered power from cursed artifacts, blood-tainted herbs, Akaviri poisons, dust taken from saints, and human skin, extracting whatever was left in each of them into himself. He struck a working relationship with Molag Bal, becoming his lieutenant on the promise of ruling Nirn as his viceroy someday. Serving later as chief advisor to an emperor named Varen Aquilarios, he secretly corrupted that emperor's own coronation ritual, triggering an event remembered as the Soul Burst, which tore open the boundary between Nirn and Coldharbour and let Molag Bal attempt to merge the two worlds into one outright, an event that came to be called the Planimeld. He eventually became the true power behind the Ruby Throne during the interregnum that followed, legalizing necromancy outright under a friendlier name. His own cult operated for years inside the Arcane University itself, disguised under the harmless-sounding name the Fellowship of Anchorites, after Manimarco had already framed and driven out the Mages Guild that once policed exactly this kind of practice. Under his regime, black soul gems became so common that ordinary citizens assumed they must be a recent invention. They were not. They traced back to one theft, generations earlier, that Manimarco himself had commissioned and never personally carried out. The thief was Vastarie, an old cohort of his from their Artaeum days, sometimes remembered as the Witch of Azura. She and Manimarco shared one specific goal: to trap souls the way a person might capture a lesser Daedra, and they agreed the secret to doing it was sitting inside Coldharbour, held by Molag Bal himself. Vastari volunteered to go in and get it. Part of her motive, by her own account, was simply wanting to impress a mage named Telakar, which makes the entire founding event of modern necromancy rest partly on a woman trying to catch someone's attention. While her fellow necromancers held a portal open behind her, she crossed into the ashen wastes of Coldharbour and came back out with the first black soul gems ever brought to Tamriel, small, able to contain even the most stubborn souls, and apparently indestructible. Nobody outside a narrow circle knew, at the time, that in an entirely different, sealed-off corner of the world, Sotha Sil had been quietly working towards something similar of his own, unaware that Vastari existed at all, which makes her claim to being first a little softer than it usually gets told. She and Manimarco fell out almost immediately after. He wanted the gems for power. She wanted to refine them for what she considered ethical reasons, and fearing what he might do to stop her, she fled with Telakar, whom she had since married. They settled in Valenwood and had a son, Callian, whose death tore them both apart. Telakar became obsessed with bringing him back, binding the boy's spirit into a flesh Atronach, and when he finally presented the finished thing to Vastaria, she was horrified by it, seeing nothing in it but an animated shade, a pale imitation of the son she had lost. She tore Callian's spirit back out of the husk, hoping it would finally pass on to wherever it was meant to go, and sealed Telakar inside the ruins where they had been living, meaning to leave him there for what she planned as a decade, so he could sit with what he had done. She kept working afterward, founding a school above a sealed set of Aled ruins to perfect what she now called a sigil geode, eventually discovering that applying one at the exact moment of death could suspend the soul inside it indefinitely. She reported the breakthrough to Vanus Galerian, hoping for his approval. It disgusted him instead, and some of her own students left to follow him rather than her. She pressed on regardless, and while researching the ruins, she uncovered old Aelid tablets referencing a Daedric herald called Irai and summoned it. It claimed to serve Azura. It actually served Molag Bal, and the ruins themselves turned out to have originally been a bridge into Coldharbour, sealed generations earlier by an Azura priestess named Kulanwe, who had ended up imprisoned inside her own seal. Vastri went in to free her. Irai lured them both into Coldharbour instead, and Vastri was trapped there for 97 years. Telakar, sealed in the ruins the whole time with no way to reach her, eventually died where she had left him, his tomb remembered afterward as the ossuary of Telakar. Whether Vestari herself was ever actually freed is something the record can't settle. Some accounts say she was. Others say she is still down there. Manimarco's own ending circled back to the same god who had given the whole discipline its start. Centuries after the heist, using the Amulet of Kings, the very artifact named earlier among the only vessels capable of holding a divine soul, he tried to trap Molag Bal's own essence inside it, aiming to make himself a god outright. He was stopped and killed at Sancretor in the Second Era, year 582, and Baal dragged what was left of him down into Cold Harbor to be tortured at a place called Heart's Grief, existing there afterward in a state the old accounts describe as neither alive nor dead. He didn't stay down. He achieved a different kind of godhood later, becoming what people call the Necromancer's Moon, a second, hidden moon that eclipses Arkay's own planet every 8 days, and each eclipse still lets his followers create fresh black soul gems to this day. His actual mortal body was finally destroyed in the Third Era, year 433. The moon kept going regardless. The diseases, the gems, the wardens who run the afterlife like a business, all of that has been a system, something built once and then left running on its own. What comes next is different. It's about people and gods doing this to each other on purpose, one betrayal at a time, all the way to a single night, far back in the First Era, that started a curse still running today, in the Fourth. The first of those betrayals happened to an entire civilization that used to rival the greatest one on the continent. The Snow Elves once had a civilization that rivaled even the Altmer of the Somerset Isles, with what the old texts call an unusually great aptitude for magic. They built a language so complex it was nearly impossible for outsiders to read, developed their own way of measuring time, and raised architecture still remembered for its magnificence, including a hidden sanctuary called the Chantry of Auriel that scholars still consider an impressive feat even today. Then the Nords arrived, and centuries of war followed, ending in a massacre remembered as the Night of Tears and a final defeat at the Battle of the Mosring, where the Snow Elves' own leader, called the Snow Prince, was killed and his people scattered. Nords took Snow Elf ears as trophies for necklaces, and a song still sung in Skyrim today, called The Slaying of the Falmer Princes, remembers the killing as a triumph rather than an atrocity. Facing extinction, what remained of the Snow Elves turned to an old, uneasy ally whose underground cities the Nords could not reach. The Dwemer took them in. Then the Dwemer forced their new wars to live on nothing but a toxic fungus that grew deep underground, which over time left them blind, and their descendants became the corrupted slaves now called Falmer. The Falmer are blind, hunched, and roughly man-sized, with no nose at all, only long, bat-like slits where a nose should be, pallid skin, and eyes described as lifeless and black. They sting badly enough that adventurers can smell them before they see them. They herd venomous charas for meat, armor, and light, keep frostbite spiders the way a farmer keeps livestock, and cook mushrooms descended from the very fungus that blinded their ancestors in the first place, meaning an entire enslaved people ended up dependent on the poison that ruined them just to keep eating. Whether the fungus alone caused the full transformation, or whether something else was also at work over the generations it took, is something even the one surviving, uncorrupted Snow Elf alive today refuses to fully accept. Travelers over the centuries have called them by half a dozen other names too, the Undermer, Snow Ghosts, Bogles, and by the Second Era, most of them had settled into Blackreach, the same vast, mushroom-lit cavern mentioned earlier as a source of soul gems, sharing it uneasily with vampire clans and the very Dwemer constructs their ancestors' masters had once built. Whatever the Snow Elves once were survives, if it survives anywhere, mostly on paper. A diary kept by a woman named Fair Agarwen mourns her people's extermination in her own words, written while it was still happening around her. A separate journal, kept by a Snow Elf named Myrtle Angoth, records the exact plan to seek shelter with the Dwemer, set down before anyone writing it knew how that shelter would end. Some scholars think two other creatures still carry a trace of that vanished civilization forward, the small, goblin-like weaklings of Solstheim, and the pale, long-eared wisp mothers that haunt certain forests, though both claims are disputed, and neither one has ever been confirmed. That Snow Elf is a knight named Gelebor of the Chantry of Auriel, and he insists on a distinction most of Tamriel has forgotten to make. He calls his fallen kin the Betrayed, not Falmer, a word he considers an insult picked up by travelers over the centuries. Over 100 Snow Elves were hiding at the isolated Chantry when the Dwemer first made their offer, word of it reaching them too late to stop it, and they lived on afterward, pitying their corrupted cousins. The Falmer didn't return the feeling. They eventually swarmed the Chantry in enough numbers to wipe out every snow elf hiding there except Gelebor, who survived his own people's massacre by their own descendants. His brother, Virthur, once the only arch-curate ever to speak directly to the god Auriel, was turned into a vampire around the same period and spent centuries afterward plotting revenge against that same god for allowing any of it to happen. Nordic folklore explains the missing noses differently and more conveniently than any of that. According to the story still told in Skyrim, Ysgramor himself cut the noses off the snow elves so his people could tell them apart from other elves in battle, and it was that mutilation, not slavery to the Dwemer, that drove them underground and doomed their entire race. It's a folktale, and both surviving accounts frame it as exactly that, a story rather than history. The actual cause was a poisoned diet forced on desperate refugees by the very people who had promised to protect them. The Nords who did the driving simply told themselves a version where the cruelty was theirs to take credit for, rather than someone else's crime they benefited from afterward. Not every snow elf made the deal at all. An unknown number rejected the Dwemer's offer outright and went into hiding instead, and some of them, by Gelebor's own account, may have survived uncorrupted into the present day somewhere nobody has found. He believes it. Nobody has confirmed it. The ones who did become Falmer eventually rebelled against the masters who blinded them, in a war fought entirely underground, out of sight of the Nords, who had started the whole chain of events by driving them out of the light in the first place. It raged for decades before finally ending around the same First Era stretch, year 700, that the Dwemer themselves vanished from Tamriel altogether, which puts the end of one betrayal and the disappearance of an entire civilization on almost the same page of the same century. One other snow elf from that same collapsing era left behind a stranger legend than either the betrayed or Gelebor's quiet survival. A wizard named Serenarth, shot down by an arrow during the Night of Tears itself, traded his own spirit for a frost Atronox with his dying strength rather than simply die. And old stories claim his frozen body is still out there today, sealed inside a glacier, waiting to thaw and settle its own score with Ysgramor's descendants. Nobody has gone looking hard enough to confirm that story either, which puts it in good company with almost everything else about this vanished people. Old torture chambers still turn up buried inside Dwemer ruins, built for exactly the purpose a person would guess, keeping distrustful elven servants in line long before any of them had fully degraded into what the Falmer eventually became. The Dwemer had them ready from early on, which suggests the cruelty was never a late development. It was built into the arrangement from close to the beginning. The Dwemer took in refugees and destroyed them slowly. Before the Dwemer themselves vanished from the world entirely, in a single moment nobody has ever explained, they had already been quietly destroying themselves too. The Dwemer disappeared from Tamriel around the First Era, year 700, and there are a number of competing theories about how, none of which anyone has ever been able to confirm. Explorers who later broke into untouched Dwemer ruins found piles of ash sitting on chairs, in beds, next to weapons and armor, as if entire households had simply been turned to dust where they sat. Whatever happened, it happened everywhere at once, to everyone. Before getting to that disappearance though, and before assuming the cheerful, funny little characters from popular children's stories about them were ever close to accurate, it helps to know what the Dwemer actually were. The real description, from people who studied them seriously, is fearsome, unfathomable, and even cruel, alongside careful, intelligent, and industrious. They mocked the gods openly, worshipped reason and logic instead of Aedra or Daedra, and treated the refugee snow elves with exactly the kind of careful, industrious cruelty that description implies, poisoning them blind and calling it hospitality. They were also already tearing themselves apart from the inside, well before whatever finally erased them. Around the First Era, year 221, Dwemer clans in Skyrim discovered a rare, glowing blue crystal called Etherium, found nowhere else in the world, alchemically inert, harmonically volatile, and impossible to smelt, mold, or break by any conventional method. 4 city-states, Arkan Tams, Raldbatar, Batar Zel, and Mzulft, formed an alliance to mine, study, and refine it, eventually building something called the Ethereum Forge to smelt the crystal using heat drawn from magma deep underground. The forge worked too well. The artifacts it produced were so powerful that the alliance shattered almost immediately, and the four city-states, along with their rivals, went to war over control of the forge itself. Nobody ever actually won it. The fighting dragged on for decades, called afterward the Ethereum Wars, until the crest needed to even open the vault holding the forge was shattered deliberately into four pieces, one kept by each city-state, because none of them trusted any of the others to hold the whole thing. The infighting left them so weakened that a Nordic king named Gellir conquered the Dwemer of Skyrim outright in only 3 years, and it took the Dwemer a full century afterward just to win their own land back. All of that, the poisoning of the Snow Elves, the civil war over a crystal nobody could even use safely, was happening around the same stretch of time as a separate, far larger project taking shape in Morrowind, led by a Dwemer named Kagranak, the foremost engineer and mage-smith his people ever produced. Beneath Red Mountain, Kagranak and his people had found something called the Heart of Lorkhan, the divine spark of a dead god that had fallen out of the sky like a meteor and formed the mountain around itself on impact. Kagranak built 3 tools meant to draw on the heart's power directly, a gauntlet without which anyone attempting the other 2 tools dies instantly, a hammer of what the old texts call divine mass, and a blade described in song as made of the sound of the shadow of the moons. His goal was nothing less than godhood for his entire people, built around an enormous automaton he called Anumidium, the brass god. At the climax of the Battle of Red Mountain, Kagranak used his tools on the heart, and in that same moment, every Dwemer then on Nirn vanished. Whether that's truly what happened, whether Nerevar and Azura caused it instead, or whether the Dwemer somehow brought it entirely on themselves, is something even scholars who have devoted their lives to the question refuse to settle. Some still doubt the whole race disappeared all at once in the first place. One Dwemer is known to have survived, purely by the accident of being somewhere else entirely when it happened, in what he only ever described as an outer realm. His name is Yagrum Bagarn, and he eventually returned to Tamriel, badly deformed by Corprus, the same disease mentioned earlier, and spent the rest of his long life looking for his own people with no success at all. He knew Kagranak personally, refused on principle to explain his old master's theories to anyone, believing they should have died with him, and has spent centuries as the last living proof that an entire civilization, clever enough to nearly build a god, can still vanish so completely that even its sole survivor has nowhere left to go looking. What that civilization actually built before any of it vanished still turns up in ruins across half the continent. Airships. Sentient constructs called animunculi, some shaped like men, some like great mechanical spiders that guarded Dwemer cities long after the people who built them were gone. Observatories and lighting systems that kept working, untouched and unmaintained, for centuries after the last hand that built them had turned to ash. They wore devices called dwarven miters that let them speak to one another across enormous distances by something called the calling, and it's thought that Kagranak, in his final moments, may have used exactly that device to summon every last one of his people to Red Mountain at once, which would mean the entire race walked into whatever finished them voluntarily, gathered there by their own leader's own voice. Kagranak wrote his own theories down in a text called Divine Metaphysics, deliberately indecipherable to anyone without years of training in the Dwemer's own arcane language, studied by his followers at a settlement called Keraka, while his personal library sat sealed away at Turenulal. Not every Dwemer who heard what he intended to do with the heart agreed it should be attempted at all, and there's no clear record of whether King Dumak, who ruled the Dwemer of Morrowind at the time, was even told the full plan in advance. Vivek, who would have known, never said. People are still testing all of this, even now. A Nord researcher named Katria spent years proving the Ethereum Wars had actually happened, then died exploring the ruins where she finally found her proof, and credit for the discovery was published afterward under someone else's name entirely. Centuries later, a researcher at the College of Winterhold named Arniel Gain tried to recreate whatever Kagrenak had done using one of Kagrenak's own recovered tools, and vanished exactly the same way the Dwemer themselves once did, which is either the closest anyone has come to confirming the old theory, or simply a second mystery this whole story has produced instead of the first one it was supposed to solve. The Dwemer's disappearance is a mystery nobody can close. What happened to a god named Trinimac isn't really a mystery so much as a story two sides tell in two completely different ways, and neither side is a neutral witness. Trinimac was, by most accounts, the strongest of all the original spirits who ever walked Nirn, Auriel's greatest knight, and in some places more popular than Auriel himself. He had already ripped Lorkhan's own heart out with his bare hands once, in the war between the gods, and tried afterward to destroy it, only for the heart to speak back to him, warning that it was the heart of the world itself, and could not simply be discarded. He and Auriel chose to hide it instead of destroying it. That was Trinimac before any of what follows. The most widely told version of what happened next says Boetia, furious at what she considered lies Trinimac was spreading about Lorkhan, disguised herself as a beautiful woman, asked him for a kiss, and swallowed him whole the moment he leaned in. She then wore his shape and used his own voice to address a crowd of Aldmer who had gathered to judge a group of dissidents following a prophet named Veloth, the movement that would eventually become the Chimer. Speaking as Trinimac, she undercut everything he had ever taught them, and once she had shamed his followers thoroughly enough, she squeezed him back out in front of everyone as a pile of dung. Some accounts say his followers rubbed that dung on their own skin afterward, changing their appearance permanently, which is given as one origin for the Chimer people themselves. Trinimac, tortured and exiled afterward into a realm of choking ash, cut open his own chest in rage to tear the shame out of his spirit, and was reborn as Malakath, remembered ever since as nothing more than a weak and vengeful version of his former glory. A separate older account tells it completely differently, and the two do not fit together no matter how it gets arranged. In this version, the being confronting the Velothi dissidents was never Trinimac at all. It was Boethia, exactly as she had always been, and the loud, hostile figure everyone assumed was Trinimac was actually a separate demon called Malak, King of Curses, who had cursed an entire following of orcs into believing they were elves and into seeing him as Trinimac. Boethia reveals the truth. The curse lifts, and Malak, enraged, throws himself down her own throat, causing her to collapse retching blood. Only after Azura and Mephala intervene to cast the curse back out does something resembling Trinimac's old shape reappear, and that reborn cursed figure is what becomes Malakath. In this telling, Trinimac was innocent the entire time, and Malakath isn't really Trinimac twisted by shame. He's a different curse entirely wearing a familiar face. Malakath himself, asked about his own most famous origin story, the swallowing and the dung, has dismissed it as too literal-minded, which most scholars take to mean the shape of the story might be roughly right, even if the details are not meant to be taken at face value. A woman named Madame Wim, an information broker with no religious stake in either version, put the real question more bluntly than anyone else on record. She asked, which was actually more likely, that an all-powerful spirit was swallowed and recast as a shadow of himself, or that mortal scholars with an obvious bias simply seized on a convenient metaphor because it let them treat an entire people, the orcs, as the literal excrement of a fallen god. She also pointed out that the written histories of Nirn treat the Orsimer with a peculiar and particular cruelty that shows up nowhere else quite so consistently. There's a further wrinkle. Even the timeline doesn't survive cleanly. Records describe explorers encountering beings already called orcs well before this entire myth is even supposed to have happened, which would mean the people this story claims to explain existed before the story that explains them. Both the Altmer and the Velothi who tell this story treat it as a lesson, and unsurprisingly, they draw opposite lessons from the exact same event. Altmer tradition holds it up as proof of the dangers of Velothi influence. Velothi tradition holds it up as proof that Trinimac was rightly punished for trying to stop their exodus. Nobody alive can say for certain which telling, if either, is the truth, and both versions come from people with an obvious reason to prefer their own. A stone statue on Somerset Isle in a town called Amiglit still stands as a monument to whichever version a visitor prefers to believe, simply labeled The Transformation of Trinimac, offering no further comment on which of the two stories it actually depicts. A separate old tale, unrelated to either version told here, has a completely different god named Sun, wearing Trinimac's own identity at certain points in history, described only as akin to him, not quite the same being, which adds a third name to a story that already could not settle on two. A children's version of the same story, told in Seyrodil long after the fact, dresses the whole trick up as a fairy tale. Boethia is said to have come to Trinimac 3 separate times in disguise before the swallowing ever happened. First as an old woman with boils across her back, then as an old man with feet Trinimac had to wash himself just to get information out of him, and only on the third approach as the beautiful young woman he actually wanted to meet. Whether that softens the story or makes it worse depends entirely on the listener. Belief in Trinimac's actual survival never quite died out either. A king of Orsinium named Kurog reinstated Trinimac worship as the official religion of his own people in the Second Era, and generations later, a king named Gortwag Gro Nagorm built an entire priesthood teaching that Trinimac still lived somewhere and that Malakath was a separate demon lying to keep the orcs believing otherwise. Most orcs who heard that version treated it as heresy. Some kept believing it anyway, long after the city where it was taught had already fallen. That kind of theology, written entirely by the winners, becomes almost funny by comparison with the next one, because the most feared murder cult in Tamriel can't even agree on who it actually worships. Mephala is a Daedric prince associated with murder, lies, deception, sex, and secrets, known as the Web Spinner, and her own sphere is described as obscured to mortals on purpose, meaning even her own worshippers are not entirely sure what she actually wants. She interferes in mortal affairs for her own amusement and does nothing without a reason, even when that reason stays hidden. A ruined marriage, 2 peaceful factions torn into war by falsified evidence, these are the kinds of things she is said to find entertaining. She helped found the Morag Tong, the legal assassins of Morrowind, teaching the earliest Khmer how to kill their enemies quietly and organizing the clan structures that eventually became the Great Houses. The Tong itself treats every sanctioned killing as a kind of sacred reenactment, an old story about the very first murder committed at the dawn of time, carried out only under a legal writ issued by one of the Great Houses, murder as ritual and as honor at once. Deserters from both the Tong and the Brotherhood have splintered off into smaller groups of their own over the centuries, including one calling itself the Silken Ring, which worships Mephala directly and believes the larger organizations never understood the true nature of the dark power they claim to serve, only that she does. Her own worshippers summon her on the 13th of Frostfall, and her champions are said to be marked by long, thin silver hair, regardless of what they looked like before. One orc clan devoted to her, the Morkul, sacrifice people to keep their own forge running in her name and call spiders, of all things, her children. Their mantra reduces her entire theology to 3 lines repeated back and forth among the faithful. Lust is love, lies are truth, death is life. It isn't subtle, and it isn't meant to be. Somewhere separate from Mephala's own worship, and possibly tangled up with it, sits a completely different killing organization, the Dark Brotherhood, which answers to a figure called the Night Mother. When somebody prays sincerely for another person's death, the prayer is heard, passed to a listener, then to a speaker, who arranges a contract and a price. The ritual that starts it all is called the Black Sacrament. Build an effigy of the intended victim out of actual body parts, a heart, a skull, bones, flesh, set inside a ring of candles, then stab it repeatedly with a dagger rubbed in nightshade petals, whispering a specific plea asking the sweet mother to send her child, because the sins of the unworthy must be baptized in blood and fear. Do that correctly, and an assassin in a black hooded robe eventually shows up to collect payment for a killing. Here is the part that never gets resolved. Nobody actually knows who the Night Mother is, and the different accounts describing her do not fit together at all. One book identifies her outright as Mephala herself, wearing a different name for a different audience. Another claims she was once an ordinary member of the Thieves Guild who thought murder should be a formally sanctioned part of guild business, was turned down, and started her own organization out of spite. A well-known series of historical books places her instead as the actual head of the Morak Tong. A statue in the city of Bravil marks the resting place of a woman who lived in the First Era and is tied to her own version of the story entirely, in which Sitis himself fathered 5 children with her, and she killed all 5 2 years later to send their souls to join their father in the void, only to be burned alive by her own horrified neighbors once they found out. And in the Third Era, a woman named Severa Magia simply took the title for herself, without any of that mythology behind her, and was killed within the same year by the Morag Tong for the presumption. 5 separate women, or one Daedric prince, or something else again, all wearing the exact same title across 4 eras, and the record states outright that it's unclear who the true Night Mother actually is, since there have been several women known to use it. Even inside the Dark Brotherhood, most members never meet her directly at all, dealing only with a phantom-like presence relayed through a chain of intermediaries. There's a strange detail that fits the whole mess better than anything else could. The Night Mother is said to regard the confusion about her own identity and every fictional story written about her as amusing and good for business. The most feared killing institution in Tamriel appears to be entirely comfortable not knowing who it actually kneels to. Even the one physical body most consistently associated with the title has not had an easy few centuries. It was fought over during a siege of her own crypt in the 4th Era, year 188, an assassin recovering it while the man who led that siege watched his own daughter die defending it, then kept for years afterward by an increasingly deranged caretaker who called himself her keeper, before finally being moved toward Falkreath in year 201 amid conflicting reports about whether the organization guarding her had even survived that long. Whoever or whatever the Night Mother actually is, the one thing anyone can say for certain is that her corpse has been fought over, stolen, and relocated more times than most living rulers ever are. There's one more layer to how the organization actually recruits, and it doesn't wait for anyone to volunteer. A relic called the Fangs of Sitis was given by Sitis himself to the Night Mother, who passed it down to a sect of Argonians called the Shadow Scales. Any Argonian born under the sign of the Shadow is handed over to the Brotherhood at birth, with no choice in the matter at all, and most who carry the fangs eventually either lose their minds or become little more than mindless instruments of Sitis's will, which makes them the one part of this whole murder business that was never a matter of choosing anything. Every one of those 4 was done to somebody, a whole people or a single god, without their consent ever entering into it. What comes next is different again. Namira, Hircen, the Forsworn, and Umbriel are horrors people walked into with their eyes open, choosing them the way a person chooses anything else, all the way to Molag Bal, who started as one god's insult to another and never once stopped recruiting. Namira is the Daedric prince of the ancient darkness, called the Lady of Decay, ruler of shadowy spirits and anything that inspires instinctive revulsion in ordinary people, associated with slugs, spiders, and vermin of every kind. She specifically targets people who already feel abandoned, the shunned, the ugly, the ostracized, seducing the lonely with the promise of belonging or power right at the moment they're most vulnerable to hearing it. Her worship isn't chaos. It's a rite, with a congregation and, often, an actual table. Her followers rarely live openly as anything unusual. Most work ordinary jobs, socialize normally with neighbors who have no idea, and keep their real practices hidden inside secret covens built specifically to disguise unconventional appetites, some of which run all the way to ritual murder and cannibalism performed in her honor. A group calling themselves the Forgotten Ones live so deep inside abandoned ruins that they physically recoil from daylight and react with violence whenever anyone tries to save them from the life they have chosen. A separate cult, calling themselves Namira's Forgotten, require every new member to eat human flesh simply to be allowed inside. One particular clan, the Crow Wife clan, holds a ceremony every 2 moons dark, drawing lots at random to choose a child, kin, or slave for sacrifice on what they call the ever-oozing altar, where a Hagraven matriarch cuts out the child's heart as an offering. Children she judges too weak get sacrificed outside the normal lottery entirely. When the clan calls out to Namira, centipedes and roaches carpet the floor of their ritual hut, thick enough that members pluck them up off the ground and eat them during the ceremony itself. There's a cave southeast of Markarth called Reachcliff, holding a shrine to Namira at its center, and a coven that operates out of it stages exactly this kind of feast for outsiders foolish enough to accept an invitation. A table gets set with wine, sweet rolls, bread, and goat cheese, laid out alongside pieces of human flesh and gory human bones as though the second course belonged there as naturally as the first. On at least one documented occasion, the guest of honor brought to that table was a priest of Arkai, specifically the god of proper burial, invited there to be killed and eaten, which makes the choice of victim itself part of the insult, not an accident. The same trick, dressed up as salvation, has been run on entire communities, not just individuals. In one village, a grieving painter who had lost faith in his own god after his wife died and his son fell ill was approached by Namira in his weakest moment, convinced his god had abandoned him, and commanded to mix a special paint from ingredients she chose. He used it to leave his mark on the village's sacred death mural, the very painting meant to carry the dying safely to their own afterlife, and upon his own death he was transformed into one of her corrupted spirits. For years afterward, generation after generation, villagers who came to that same mural seeking passage to their own god, instead found themselves quietly claimed by Namira through the exact ritual their ancestors had trusted to save them. Khajiit culture calls these corrupted spirits Dromathra, dark, twisted souls whose fur turns fully black, crossed with lines of glowing blue lightning, claimed by Namira upon death after a slow corruption called the Bend Dance, described as a dance without music, following only the rhythm of a beating heart that doesn't belong to the dancer. It starts small. A twitch of the tail, a tune nobody else can hear, shadows that seem to stretch a little longer than they should. Once the darkness inside a person outweighs the moonlight, salvation becomes unlikely, and the transformation completes itself. These corrupted spirits can't be killed outright, only banished, and banishing one for good means fighting it inside its own home territory, in the darkness beyond the stars, which isn't somewhere most people who try ever plan on going twice. Namira keeps her own strange doctrine about what even counts as cannibalism in the first place. Eating another person counts. Eating an ogre, by her own account, doesn't, and she is said to take offense at a follower who eats one while calling it cannibalism anyway, as if the insult were to her personally rather than to the ogre. It's an odd thing for a prince built entirely around revulsion to be particular about, and the record offers no explanation for the distinction beyond the fact that she insists on it. An Argonian village called Xal Ithix learned what her recruitment can look like from the other direction. Her servants planted a rotted relic called the Hand of Namira at the base of the village's own history, poisoning the swamp around it and, through the swamp, poisoning the tree itself, the heart, soul, and memory of the entire community all at once. Namira's own followers declared the village's hissed spirits pale shadows next to her, as if a slow, engineered corruption of a sacred tree were itself proof that her darkness was simply the stronger religion. A group called the Gosong clan claims Namira spoke to them directly once, personally choosing the clan's founding mothers to guard a set of secrets the clan still calls the Prophecy of the Dark Heart, and leading the very first of those matrons to a bottomless pit beneath a place called Lost Valley Redoubt that the clan has quietly watched over ever since. Whatever waits down there, the clan has never said, and nobody outside it has ever come back up to describe it either. Namira's right waits for people who are already vulnerable. What Hircine offers isn't really a trick at all, and that turns out to be the more disturbing version. Every person who becomes a werewolf belongs to Hircine when they die, whether they ever worshipped him or not. A great wolf drags the unwilling soul physically into his realm, the hunting grounds, whether the soul agrees to go or not, and for the people of Skyrim, who hope to reach a warrior's afterlife called Sovngarde instead, lycanthropy functions as a trapdoor built directly into death itself. For his actual followers, the ones who wanted this, it's a good deal, and that's exactly the problem. Believers are promised spectacular hunts without end, bodies that never sicken, and an endless cycle of death and rebirth inside a realm of oversized wilderness, dense woodland, red-skied grassland, hunting lodges scattered everywhere a person could want one. Werebears and Nords stalk that land by day. When the sun goes down, Hircine himself takes over with a pack of his own wolves, and the cycle simply repeats forever. For the faithful, the old accounts call it a paradise, without qualification. One werewolf lord named Vykosa built the largest pack Tamriel had ever seen and still turned against Hircine eventually, resentful of being prey as much as predator even inside her own supposed reward, which suggests even paradise here comes with fine print nobody reads until they're already living inside it. Hircine does hold to one rule that never bends, something close to a law of fair hunting. Prey always gets a genuine chance to escape, and a hunter who somehow turns the tables and starts hunting the hunter's back can actually earn his respect rather than his anger. It's the one part of the whole arrangement that looks less like cruelty and more like an actual code, even if it's a code built entirely around the idea that someone, somewhere, is always supposed to be running from something. The realm has its own geography, named and mapped like any ordinary country. A stretch called the March of Sacrifices cycles through dusk, night, and back again every few minutes. As a hunter crosses it, the plants themselves changing color with the light. A lava tube called the Hunter's Grotto serves certain clans as a coming-of-age site. A portal in the rift leads to somewhere called the Hunter's Glade, one of the only places in the realm where a werewolf can simply stay transformed indefinitely, never bothering to change back at all. Every so often, rarely on Nirn itself, but constantly inside Hircine's own realm, he holds what is called a Great Hunt, a grand contest between competitors purely for his entertainment, and when one happens on Nirn instead of inside his own domain, the second moon turns visibly red, an event people call the Blood Moon, and it doesn't fade until the hunt itself is finished. There's one way out, and it's cruel specifically because of how narrow it's. If lycanthropy gets cured after death, but before Hircine's own collection of that soul actually happens, the freed soul can still reach its proper afterlife instead. Nobody has ever stated exactly how long that window lasts. The clearest example on record is a companion named Kodlak Whitemane, who led an order that had been tricked generations earlier into believing lycanthropy would not be permanent. Kodlak wanted out. He was killed before the cure could be completed on him while he was alive. His own order hunted down what they called his wolf spirit after his death and destroyed it in time, curing him retroactively and letting him pass into Sovngarde after all. He spent his own afterlife hoping to someday lead a raid back into the hunting grounds to rescue the rest of his order, who never got the same chance he did, and whether that's even possible, whether a soul can be pulled back out once Hircine already has it, is something nobody has ever confirmed either way. Reachmen who take on the curse deliberately tend not to describe it as a gift at all, closer instead to the same logic behind the Briarheart ritual mentioned earlier, a useful sacrifice a person makes so they can serve their clan better, not a blessing enjoyed for its own sake. Those who want to belong fully to Hircine rather than merely carry his curse can seek out his own kind directly, present tribute after a successful hunt, and if the hunt goes well enough, get inducted properly into his own pack, gaining a level of control over their wolf shape ordinary lycanthropes never manage. It amounts, in its own way, to a promotion, inside an organization built entirely around being hunted or doing the hunting. Kodlak's order was tricked once, generations back, by a promise the Empire never intended to keep. The Reachmen were tricked by almost the exact same kind of promise, and it's what built the Forsworn. In the Fourth Era, year 174, with the Great War against the Aldmeri Dominion, pulling imperial legions out of every outer province, including the Reach. A group of Reachmen who had always considered themselves the true owners of that land rose up, broke through Markarth's gates while the city sat nearly undefended, and took the entire Reach for themselves. By most accounts, they ruled it peacefully for roughly 2 years, executing only the harshest Nord landowners, cosmopolitan enough that the new kingdom actually petitioned the empire for formal recognition as a province. Then, in year 176, with no legions to spare, the empire and a local jarl turned to a Nord militia leader named Ulfric Stormcloak, promising his men free worship of the god Talos in exchange for retaking the city. Ulfric's militia stormed Markarth and reconquered it, and what followed wasn't a clean handover of power. Nords executed forsworn officials and any citizen who had not joined Ulfric's side, including the elderly and children judged old enough to fight, and tortured natives to give up the names of rebels who had fled into the wilderness. Survivors of that reprisal kept fighting anyway, scattering across the Reach and forming what became known as the Forsworn. The promise made to Ulfric's men didn't hold either. When the Talmor discovered Talos worship still happening in Markarth afterward, the local jarl was forced to arrest Ulfric and his men or risk war with the Dominion outright, and the broken promise left a grudge that eventually widened into an entirely separate rebellion of its own. The same jarl who ordered Markarth's brutal reconquest was, years later, killed by the very Forsworn his own cruelty had helped create. Outsiders dismissed the Forsworn as something close to 2 septims short of a pint of ale, madmen who can't be reasoned with. The actual record says the opposite, and says it plainly. Despite appearing primitive, they have proven to be an aggressive political force with an astute grasp of insurgent warfare, keeping agents hidden inside Markarth's own population and opposing the Nords, the Empire, and the Thalmor all at the same time, a 3-way fight most organized nations would struggle to manage. Their raids on caravans leave nobody alive but take almost nothing, because the point was never robbery, it was the message. They organize themselves in cells specifically meant to strike fear into their occupiers, refuse every offer of peace that doesn't include the return of their own land, and fight without any apparent concern for whether they live through the encounter or not. The horror here was never that they were savage. It's that everyone kept calling them mad while they ran, by any honest measure, one of the more disciplined insurgencies on the continent. Their most effective leader, a man named Madanach, wasn't beaten in open battle at all. He was secretly imprisoned by a mining lord named Thonar Silverblood, who calculated correctly that holding one man quietly was worth more than fighting an entire rebellion out in the open. Even the basic history of their brief, peaceful kingdom is disputed. One imperial scholar wrote an account describing it as cosmopolitan and well-run, while a Nord jarl who lived through the period directly contradicted him on details nobody bothered to specify, which means even the 2 years when the Forsworn briefly governed themselves in peace can't be agreed upon by the people who were actually there. That same imperial scholar later wrote an entirely separate book in their defense, and gave it a title that simply repeated the insult back at everyone using it, calling his own sympathetic account of the uprising by the same mocking nickname his countrymen already used, as if the best way to defend the Forsworn was to make peace with what they were already being called. The Forsworn chose to keep fighting even against 3 enemies at once. Somewhere else on Tamriel, an entire flying city chose to keep existing, and the price of that choice gets paid every single day by whoever happens to be standing underneath it. Umbriel is a floating city that runs, quite literally, on the people it kills beneath itself. Its origin traces back to a Daedric sword called Umbra, created for the Prince Clavicus Vial as a tool for trapping souls, stabilized with a piece of Vial's own power, which turned out to be a mistake, because that piece of power became aware of itself and started calling itself Umbra, a being with, as one account puts it, eyes like holes into nothing. Vial denied Umbra was ever really a person at all, dismissing him as nothing more than an aspect of himself with delusions of being separate. Umbra escaped Vial's realm eventually with the help of a Dunmer mage named Wuhon, who built a device called an Ingenium that tore a chunk of Vial's realm loose and turned it into its own floating city. Umbra fused with Wuhon afterward, and the combined being took the name Umbriel and ruled the city as its lord. The ingenium is the whole mechanism. People killed on the ground below Umbriel power, the device that keeps the city aloft and sustains everyone living on it, a pact made with Umbra that has to be fed continuously to keep functioning. The city's own population, called Umbrielans, are born straight into adult bodies harvested from those souls, live short lives, 10 to 15 years is considered old, and when they die, their souls get recycled through worm-like creatures and reborn into new bodies with no memory of who they used to be. Even food gets divided along the same grim logic. Minor lords in the lower kitchens eat ordinary meals. Higher lords in the upper kitchens eat food made specifically from processed souls, an entire aristocracy quietly built around consuming the dead. Hairless, monkey-like servants called hobs work the lower kitchens as help, and out at the edges of the island, in a region called the Fringe Gyre, cousins of the same histories that called the city into being in the first place, grow fruit and even metal for the population above, their roots reaching so deep into the lower levels that in a real sense, they're Umbriel every bit as much as the Ingenium is. Whatever the kitchens do not use ends up in a section simply called the Lower Middens, a name that undersells what it actually is, a vast room of discarded kitchen waste left to be eaten and broken down by worms before any of it gets used again. The whole cycle of the city's dead running, in the end, through what amounts to a garbage pit. The city was called to Tamriel in the 4th era, year 48, and the reason it came at all traces back to a single tree. A rogue hist in the city of Lilmoth had cut itself off from the shared consciousness that links every other hist tree on the continent, an isolation it had already gone through once before, generations earlier, after an older version of the same tree had been killed. This estranged, isolated tree spoke only to a narrow political faction in Lilmoth, and it was that tree, reaching root to root across realities, that made contact with Umbriel's own sentient trees, and called the Flying City to Tamriel, lured by a promise from a prime minister named Hierem that the power of the White Gold Tower could finally cut Umbriel loose from Clavicusville for good. The promise was a trap of its own. Hierem actually intended to steal the thousands of souls trapped inside Umbriel's ingenium for himself, hoping their combined power would let him become a god. Umbriel's advance across Tamriel left a trail of massacred cities, Lilmoth, Gideon, Stormhold, each one's dead reanimated and folded into the invading army as it moved. At one battle alone, Soul Spinners, Umbriel's living weapon for harvesting the dead, killed nearly 3,000 levitated Imperial soldiers in midair. The city was finally banished before it ever reached the Imperial city, and in the chaos of that final confrontation, Clavicus Vile reclaimed the spirit of Umbra and absorbed every soul still trapped inside the Ingenium, taking back everything the city had ever stolen from him in the first place. Umbriel itself drifted off afterward and settled quietly into a distant bog, a city that spent its entire existence trying to escape one god and ended by feeding him everything it had anyway. The final confrontation that ended it was as strange as anything else in the story. Clavicus Vile manifested by taking over the body of a prince named Atribus Mede, using it to stab Wuhon with the Umbra sword itself, and Wuhon fell onto the Ingenium with the blade still in his chest. Man, sword, and machine dissolved together into black smoke and reformed as a towering avatar of Vile, who meant to drain every remaining soul on Umbriel and then drop the entire city onto the Imperial city below. He was stopped only because the rogue hist of Lilmoth, working through an Argonian who had by then become physically part of the island himself, banished both Vile and the city together, buying just enough time for Wuhon's own stubborn will to hold Vile back until it was done. Those 4 were bargains, bad ones most of the time, but bargains, with somebody choosing to sit down at the table in the first place. Vaermina, Hermaeus Mora, and Molag Bal never needed anyone else at that table at all. Vaermina is the Daedric prince of dreams and nightmares, and from her citadel at the center of her own realm, she reaches directly into the minds of sleeping mortals and collects their memories, leaving behind nothing but visions of horror and despair that isn't a metaphor for what a nightmare is. According to the old texts, that's literally what a nightmare is, mechanically, an act of theft happening to sleeping people every single night, and nobody has ever worked out what she actually does with everything she takes. Her signature weapon, the Skull of Corruption, is a staff that creates a duplicate of anyone it's used on, setting the copy against the original at the wielder's command. And legend holds that the staff itself has a mind of its own, able to feed on the memories of anyone nearby, echoing its own maker exactly. Her worshippers once kept that skull at a fortified temple overlooking the town of Dawnstar, and the artifact worked exactly as advertised on the wrong target. It inflicted an entire orc war party with nightmares so severe that the orcs attacked the temple specifically to destroy it. Losing that fight, with the artifact about to fall into enemy hands, the worshippers released something called the miasma, a gas originally built for an entirely different purpose, to slow the aging process during rituals that were meant to last months or years at a time. Deployed as a last resort weapon instead, it put everyone inside the temple to sleep all at once, attackers included, and the temple simply sat there afterward, forgotten. Her ordinary worshippers, away from that one battle, keep up their own quieter practices, holding blood sacrifices both to petition her directly and to summon lesser Daedra out of quagmire when the need arises. Constant exposure to the horrors she shows them is said to leave her truest believers less afraid of anything else the world can throw at them, which may be the closest thing to a genuine blessing anyone gets out of worshipping the Prince of Nightmares. It worked exactly as well as it was supposed to. Centuries later, they're still asleep. The temple stayed sealed and undisturbed until the dreams leaking out of it started to reach the nearby town of Dawnstar, whose people began suffering constant nightmares of their own because the skull inside had never stopped feeding, reaching out from behind a sealed door to torment the living from a building nobody living had entered in generations. Whoever eventually goes in to deal with, it's offered a choice by Vaermina herself before it's over, an offer to betray the one ally who got them there in exchange for keeping the skull. And what choice gets made, in the end, is something the record leaves open. The guide who eventually leads a visitor back into that temple generations on turns out to have his own reason for going. He serves Mara now, the goddess of love, having left Vaermina's worship behind, but under the god he abandoned he was once called Brother Casimir, and it was his own hand that released the miasma on the night everyone inside fell asleep in the first place. He comes back to finish what his younger self started, walking a visitor through a recreated memory of that exact night, seen through his own eyes, before he is finally ready to try to put the whole thing right. Vaermina's other servants, called omens, work a quieter version of the same theft on people who are still very much alive. They slip into a sleeping mind and nudge its owner toward decisions that person would otherwise call foolish or shameful, sometimes forcing a sleeper to relive their very worst memory over and over, and the only way to drive one out for good is to hunt it down and kill it inside the dream it's haunting, since killing the dreamer's body does nothing to it at all. Her own priests are reputed to be gifted alchemists on the side, brewing potions that fetch a serious price on the black market, and one of them, called Vaermina's Torpor, lets the drinker slip fully into someone else's dream and travel real distances while unconscious, sometimes waking up thousands of miles from where they fell asleep, though death or simply vanishing outright are both, by the same account, very real possibilities every time it's used. Two devotees glimpsed inside a recreated memory of the night the miasma was first released, a man and a woman named Verendulari and Torek, show none of the mental decay the gas is supposed to inflict on anyone who breathes it, still speaking and thinking as clearly in that memory as anyone standing outside it. Nobody has ever explained why those two, of everyone in that temple, seem to have been spared the one effect the gas is otherwise known for. Vaermina steals what people already have while they're unconscious and can't refuse. Hermaeus Mora does something almost the opposite, and it turns out to be worse, because everyone who deals with him gets exactly what they actually asked for. Hermaeus Mora is the Daedric Prince of Forbidden Knowledge, and the clearest description of what he actually wants comes down to a single idea. His curiosity has no limit, and he seeks all knowledge to observe it rather than to change it, so that everything eventually becomes known. He has no plan for any individual person who comes to him. To the ancient Atmorans and the Bosmer, he was known as Herma Mora, the woodland man, or, in an older translation, that which speaks in the wastes, a title that fits a being who mostly doesn't bother appearing as anything human at all, showing up instead as a shifting cloud of eyes, tentacles, and claws, or a featureless purple vortex, speaking with what the old accounts call a thundering bray. His other titles pile up the way Periates did earlier: the Demon of Knowledge, the Master of the Tides of Fate, the Lord of Secrets, the Eye that Wanders, and, older and stranger than the rest, the Ur-Deidra, a designation that puts him among the very oldest things this world ever produced. Older, some accounts say, than the line between Aedra and Deidra had even been drawn yet. He is called the Gardener of Men, and his followers describe him as weeping cold tears over a plague of ignorance, sincerely wishing to enlighten everyone to every mystery that has ever existed. The same texts immediately undercut that benevolent image. This kindness may be a mask, since Mora is also known to hoard knowledge and give away nothing for free, described elsewhere as crafty, skilled at hiding things, and fond of traps. Every named mortal who actually reached his secrets got exactly what they were looking for, and every single one of them paid for it in the same coin. A mage named Morian Zenas physically entered Mora's realm and survived direct exposure to something called a known thing, a category of truth the mind isn't built to hold, at the cost of bleeding from the ears and permanent damage to his sanity. He described what he saw as inky black and wriggling, tasting of raspberries, and reported afterward that it let him become many multitudes of himself at once. He disappeared into Mora's realm not long after, and was never confirmed to have come back out. A mage named Septimus Signus, already damaged from reading an Elder Scroll, spent years working toward a single locked box Mora dangled in front of him. The moment he finally opened it and found what was inside, Mora destroyed him outright, having outlived his usefulness the instant the task was complete. A dragon priest named Mirak sought power from Mora and got exactly that. Centuries of it, growing stronger in isolation while he waited for a chance to return to the world, until Mora simply grew tired of using him and traded him in for a newer, more useful champion instead. Even a Skal spiritual leader named Storn, who never sought Mora's knowledge for himself at all, died the moment sacred knowledge was extracted from his own body to pay for someone else's boon. Scholars have a name for what is left of a person once this process runs its full course. When a mortal learns a secret too large for their mind to contain, the contents of that mind get displaced, memories and ambitions and old desires fading out one at a time, until only the thirst to know more remains, and the person casts aside everything they used to be in pursuit of more secrets. They call it the hush, and the people it happens to, the hushed. Nobody in this whole account walked away from Mora clean, sane, and unchanged. Every one of them wanted exactly what they got, and every one of them is proof that getting it was never actually the safe part. Khajiit myth tells of exactly one mortal who came away from him clean. A trickster named Rajan is said to have stolen a glimpse into Mora's own underwater library, then tricked him into revealing every one of his countless eyes at once. Using that single moment of distraction to steal a book called the Ogma Infinium and escape before Mora could stop him. It's remembered as a myth, not a history, and no other account anywhere in the record describes anyone else pulling off the same trick, which makes it either the one exception that proves the rule, or simply the one story a culture that has otherwise lost every round against him still allows itself to keep telling. One nameless worshipper asked Mora for something almost gentle by comparison, ears that could listen in on other people's dreams, and Mora granted it exactly as asked. The gift soured almost immediately into a curse, condemning the man to wander what the old account calls a forest of waking horrors, and he vanished from ordinary life soon after, leaving behind only a pet rabbit that had somehow started showing the same marks Apocrypha leaves on anyone who spends too long inside it. Even his own name carries a kind of quiet joke inside it. One reading of the old Aldmeri roots behind Hermamora translates closer to a grove in the wilderness, or a hidden grove, the same old idea, in a different language entirely, behind the phrase, seek the truth in the Garden of Academe. Another, stricter reading of the same syllables comes out instead as the unstable man. Scholars can't agree which translation is closer to correct, which feels appropriate for a being whose entire nature is an argument nobody can quite finish having. Hermaeus Mora's mortals all volunteered for what happened to them. What happened to the first vampire never involved her agreement at all, and it turns out to be the origin of every vampire that has ever existed since, built entirely out of one god's contempt for another god's hobby. Arkai is the god of the cycle of life and death, the lord of the wheel of life, associated with proper burial and the changing of the seasons, and his priests are the sworn opponents of necromancy and the undead in every form. Any body buried properly under a priest of Arkai observing the correct rites is protected from ever being raised again. Necromancers consider him their natural enemy and quietly work to undermine his worship wherever they can. Molag Bal disliked him specifically, and specifically because of that, because Arkai took open pride in his own particular sphere, the ordinary, natural turning of life into death and back again, the very cycle Molag Bal considers something to be exploited rather than respected. His own realm gives some sense of the kind of god doing the disliking. Cold Harbor is built as a mocking, apocalyptic copy of the real world, complete with its own defiled version of the white gold tower, lit by a sky that burns in a continuous belch of fire under permanent purple cloud, its floating islands of blackened rock covered in blue lichen hanging over nothing at all. Scholars who have visited and lived to describe it call it a manifestation of fear and exploitation, and one of them put it more simply, writing that in Cold Harbor everything stares back at Molag Bal with his own face, since his image is carved, painted, or cast into practically every surface of the realm he rules. The realm even keeps a kind of legal system, a place called the Court of Contempt, where the defense is always played by lesser Daedra in ridiculous wigs who are never actually permitted to speak, and the conviction rate runs at exactly 100 out of 100. Elsewhere sit the cliffs of failure, where mortals and Daedra alike who have disappointed him are set against each other in a contest that can't be won, purely so he can watch, and a place remembered as the Grotto of Depravity, an endless party thrown for informants who served him well, though even there the eternally tormented soul-shriven are made to keep serving drinks at their own celebration. Molag Bal himself is described, in his fully manifested form, as broad and sinewy, standing on digitigrade legs like some kind of enormous beast, with a ridge of spikes running down his spine into a tail shaped like a three-pronged axe, a skull-like face, and blue-gray flesh that darkens to black toward his extremities. Cut open, it releases a thick, viscous blue substance rather than ordinary blood. Scholars have argued for generations over something they call the Molag Bal paradox, the question of whether a prince whose entire sphere is domination can truly embody domination at all if enough mortals simply stop believing he exists, a debate that has never been resolved and, fittingly, never seems likely to be. For a being surrounded by every luxury an entire stolen realm can produce, he is also, by more than one account, said to have terrible hygiene and to smell faintly, always, of rotting flesh. His own personal library sits apart from the propaganda archive mentioned in passing at his realm's description, shelves that scholars describe as spanning entire cliffs and running deep into a chasm, stacked with the kind of books no sane library elsewhere would shelve at all. A separate collection, called the Library of Dusk, exists purely to spread his version of events to anyone foolish enough to wander in looking for information, doubling as a trap for the exact kind of curious scholar who assumes a library is always a safe place to be. A traveling mage named Morian Zenas, the same one whose name turns up again wherever forbidden knowledge is discussed, once passed through Cold Harbor on his travels through Oblivion, and reportedly wept simply at the sight of it, which says as much about the realm as anything a native of it could ever say themselves. So Molag Bal, according to an old account called the opusculus Lamae Balta Mezzamorti, traveled to a newly formed Tamriel, found a Nedic priestess of Arkai named Lamae Beolfag, raped her, and left. That's the entire act, stated plainly, and nothing more needs to be added to it. Nedic nomads found her afterward and took her in to nurse her back to health, and noticed something wrong immediately. Her mangled body was corrupted by something they could not name. Her wounds, strangely, began to heal on their own. Believing she had died anyway, the group who had cared for her attempted to cremate her, and on the night of her own funeral, she rose up off the burning pyre and killed every one of them. Her curse spread from there across Tamriel in one form or another, described in the old accounts as making a mockery of Arkai's beloved sphere, which is exactly what it was built to do. Every vampire that has ever existed since traces back, in some fashion, to that single act, which means an entire recurring feature of the world, one that has shaped wars, religions, and whole bloodlines for thousands of years, exists because one god wanted to personally insult another god's hobby. It didn't stop working once the insult had landed. It kept working. The souls of vampires, by most accounts, are sent to Coldharbour when they die, which means Molag Bal continues collecting the yield of that first assault for as long as vampirism itself continues to exist, forever, on a compounding basis. Not every source agrees the arrangement is quite that airtight. Some hold instead that a soul's final destination depends on the choices a person made in life rather than any curse imposed on their body, and there are at least a few recorded exceptions, souls that seem to have reached other afterlives despite dying as vampires. But the version most widely repeated, and the one Molag Bal himself seems to prefer, is that he collects them all, without exception, forever. He has not always been gentle with the vampires who serve him either. He once struck a bargain, back in the First Era, with a vampire king named Styrish, leader of a group called the Grey Host, and when the terms came due, 13 of that host's own leadership were dragged into Coldharbour anyway and tortured there for eternity as part of the payment. Inside Coldharbour sits a place called Ashbound Hall. Built specifically to hold vampires, Baal has simply taken from their lives on Nirn at random, forcing them to fight each other for his entertainment since there are no mortals down there to feed on, and he has, on occasion, transformed the captive into something that craves blood constantly but can never actually feed on it. A very specific, custom-made torment. Centuries later, the last leader of that same Grey Host found a partial way to pull vampire souls back out of Coldharbour using something called Harrowstorms, which means even this one arrangement, built to run forever without exception, has at least one confirmed crack in it. The account isn't the only one on record either, and the different traditions disagree. Tribunal Temple doctrine in Morrowind tells its own version, in which Molag Bal gives the first vampire a different origin, a defeated foe instead of Lamé, though the doctrine itself can't settle on what that foe actually was, a Daedra lord in one telling, a temple saint in another, a powerful beast in a third. People around the Elig Bay believe instead that vampirism came from cursed artifacts, or a wizard's curse, with no further detail given anywhere. And Dunmer nationalists in the Third Era blamed the whole affliction on necromancy imported from the West, a claim the record itself flags as likely temple propaganda, mixed with an existing cultural hatred of foreigners and necromancers alike. The accounts differ, and the version involving Lamé is simply the one told most often, not the one everyone agrees on. At least one of Molag Bal's own worshippers in Morrowind has gone on record insisting vampires were never his creation at all, and the surviving text is honest enough to admit nobody knows whether she is simply mistaken or privy to something the rest of Tamriel isn't. A female vampire lord of pure blood, gifted the condition directly by Molag Bal's own hand rather than catching it from another vampire, carries a specific title, a daughter of Coldharbour, marking her out from everyone who only inherited the curse secondhand. Lamé herself didn't stay a victim in the story either. She founded her own cult afterward, considering its members her children and being addressed by them as Mother Lamé, built around the shared hatred of both Arkai and Molag Bal at once, hating the god who cursed her every bit as much as the one whose fear she had been turned into a weapon against. Whether that makes her the first vampire's founder or its first and angriest survivor probably depends on which part of the story a person chooses to sit with longest. That was the origin. What follows is why it never really ended. Lamai's curse was never a story that simply concluded and stopped. Vampires were already established in Somerset as far back as the Merethic era, generations before most of the history covered up to this point had even happened, and an Altmer alchemist of that same early period, Asliel Direni, is remembered for developing one of the first countermeasures against them, a potion that poisoned the vampire's meal from the inside without harming the person being fed on. Vampire assassins served an Islade city called Abagarlas before the First Era had even reached year 198, sent out to hunt down rival knights on behalf of a king who worshipped Molag Bal directly. A clan called the Night Hollow existed under the surface of Skyrim before year 221 of that same era, one of the first vampire bloodlines to carve out an entire kingdom underground, sustained for a time by an artifact called the Dark Heart rather than blood at all, until a rival queen inside their own ranks abandoned the whole clan to starve rather than share what little power was left. None of that required anyone's continued involvement from Molag Bal himself. What does require him, still, right now, is the newer bloodlines, because mortals keep making pacts with him voluntarily to become vampires, and he keeps accepting, provided the mortal asking is already powerful enough in their own right to be worth the trouble. Being chosen as an offering on his own summoning day is considered an honor among his followers, and those selected are expected to go through with it. Few survive the ritual itself. The ones who do emerge as pure-blooded vampires, carrying his gift directly rather than catching it secondhand. A vampire lord named Harkon and his entire family are remembered as having been turned this exact way, by Molag Bal's own hand rather than by infection, and new bloodlines keep getting founded on the same basic principle even now. Mortal ambition finding new ways to court the same old bargain. An alchemist named Lady Esenia, working entirely on her own initiative in the Second Era, blended several existing vampire bloodlines together using a substance native to Coldharbour itself, and the strain she produced now spawns something called Blood Knights, proof that mortals no longer even need Molag Bal's personal attention to keep the curse spreading in new directions he never asked for. Somewhere inside Coldharbour, past the Court of Contempt and the Cliffs of Failure, sit a handful of other places worth naming just for the sound of them. The Endless Stair, once used as a staging ground for the Planimeld itself. The Vaults of Madness, a labyrinth nobody bothers mapping properly. And the Wailing Prison, where, centuries after Lamai's own curse began, an entirely different plan of Molag Bal's finally came apart, in the same place he had once used to sacrifice the soul-shriven by the thousand. Molag Bal's curse turns out to be the oldest horror of them all, and the one still taking applications. Every enchanted blade anyone in Tamriel has ever carried, the sword mentioned back at the very start of all this, still runs, in some small part, on a piece of the same god who assaulted Lamai Beelfog, poisoned the Snow Elves' one chance at safety, and built an afterlife the ideal masters run like a business for their own supposed guests. A corpus victim in Telfir is kept alive right now by a wizard chasing a cure that doesn't exist. A soul in the soul cairn is, somewhere, this very moment, forgetting the last of who it used to be. The Forsworn are still fighting, on the same terms, against the same three enemies, and Molag Bal is still collecting. None of that's unusual by the standards of everything covered here. It has all been unusual only in how ordinary it looks from the outside. A rash that turns out to be a curse. A piece of jewelry that turns out to be a god's manufacturing surplus. A bargain that looks fair right up until it doesn't. All of it, from a rash with a full cure to a night that never really ended. And somewhere out there tonight, somebody is about to enchant a sword, mine a soul gem out of the ground, or make a quiet deal they think is entirely their own idea. They will not think about any of this while they do it. That was always more or less the point.